Hello, dear listeners. Settle in for a tale of hardship and strength, of fear and cunning, and of children lost in the darkness who find their way back to the light. This is the story of Hansel and Gretel, where hunger drives desperation, cruelty is met with cleverness, and kindness is rewarded. Now, sit back, relax, breathe, and let us begin. Hansel and Gretel, an adaptation of the original story collected by the Brothers Grimm and read as a story to relax to by me, John Donaldson. At the edge of a vast and ancient forest, where towering pines cast long shadows upon the earth, a poor woodcutter lived in a small cottage with his wife and 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. Now, the wife was not the mother of the children. Their mother had passed away years before, and the woodcutter had remarried. Although he worked tirelessly, swinging his axe from dawn until dusk, misfortune had spread across the land. A terrible famine reached the village, and food became scarce. Each night, as the wind howled through the thin wooden walls of their home, hunger gripped their bellies like a tight fist, leaving them restless and weak. One evening, as the fire in their hearth burned low, the woodcutter sat with his head in his hands, his face a picture of sorrow. His wife, hardened by desperation, leaned toward him and whispered a cruel suggestion. She insisted that if they did not get rid of the children, all 4 of them would die of starvation. They must take Hansel and Gretel deep into the forest and leave them there. The woodcutter gasped in horror at her words, refusing to abandon his beloved children. But his wife's voice was sharp and unyielding. She reminded him of their own hunger, of the hollow-eyed suffering of their children, and of the certainty that starvation was waiting for all of them. Lying in their small bed, Hansel and Gretel overheard every word. Gretel trembled, her small hands holding tightly to her brother's arm. But Hansel, ever clever and resourceful, whispered that he would find a way to save them. Long after their parents had fallen asleep, he crept outside. The moon was high, casting silver light upon the ground, where smooth white pebbles glowed like tiny stars. He collected as many as he could, stuffing them into his pockets before slipping silently back inside to bed. At dawn, their stepmother's voice rang through the cottage, unnaturally cheerful. She handed them each a small piece of bread and announced that they were to accompany their father into the woods to gather firewood. Their father, his face drawn with silent sorrow, said nothing as they set out. As they walked, Hansel discreetly dropped the pebbles one by one from his fingers, leaving a trail that only he and Gretel would recognize. The deeper they walked into the forest, the taller the trees became, their twisted branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that swallowed the light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. and the only sounds were the rustling of unseen creatures and the occasional call of a distant owl. After many hours, they reached a small clearing where their father built a fire. He told them to rest and promised to return soon. But as the fire burned away to smouldering embers and the sun dipped below the treetops, it became clear that their father was not coming back for them. When the full moon rose, its pale glow illuminated the path of white pebbles. Hand in hand, Hansel led Gretel through the twisting forest, their bare feet brushing against the cold leaves and roots. The night stretched long and scary, filled with whispers of wind and shadows that seemed to move just beyond sight. But by the time dawn broke, they found themselves standing once again in front of their father's cottage. Their father, overwhelmed with relief, gathered them into his arms, whispering apologies into their hair. But their stepmother's smile was thin and cold, her eyes narrowing in displeasure. Though her plan had failed once, she would not fail again so easily. Days passed, but the famine grew worse, its grip tightening like a strong hand around a throat. The stepmother's patience wore thin, and soon she demanded that the children be abandoned once more. This time she took precautions, locking their bedroom door so that Hansel could not gather pebbles by night. At dawn she woke the children up, pressing stale crusts of bread into their hands. Hansel, desperate, crumbled his portion into tiny pieces as they walked, letting them fall behind them like scattered grains of hope. The journey was longer this time, the trees taller, their tangled branches blotting out the sky. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, as though the forest itself threatened to swallow them whole. Eventually they reached another clearing where their father built a fire, but once again, by the time darkness fell, their father had not returned. Hansel looked for his trail, but to his horror, the breadcrumbs had vanished, eaten by the hungry birds of the forest. They were suddenly filled with a cold dread. There was no path home now. They were truly alone and helpless to find their way back. For 3 days they wandered in the direction they thought was home, but in fact they were heading the wrong way. Their stomachs were aching and their legs were getting weaker. The trees stretched endlessly before them, their roots twisting up like skeletal fingers, as if the very earth was trying to trap them. At night they shivered beneath the roots of an ancient oak, their hunger clawing at them like an unseen beast. Then, as the golden morning light streamed through the branches, they stumbled upon something miraculous. In the middle of a small clearing stood a house unlike any they had ever seen. Its walls were made of gingerbread, its roof thickly thatched with cake, and its windows were panes of clear sugar that caught the sunlight like polished gemstones. A warm, sweet scent filled the air, honey and cinnamon, roasted almonds and vanilla. Overcome by hunger, the children rushed forwards, breaking off pieces of the house and devouring them eagerly. The gingerbread crumbled between their fingers, warm and rich, the sugar windows crisp and sweet. Just then the door creaked open. An old woman appeared, draped in a heavy shawl, her eyes almost shut, and her face lined with age. But her voice was gentle as she beckoned them inside, promising them warmth, rest, and more food than they could ever eat. Weak with exhaustion, they followed without question, relief clearly showing in their smiles. Inside, their house was a wonder of warmth and comfort. A great fire crackled in the hearth, its golden light dancing on the walls. A table was laden with steaming bowls of porridge, fresh milk, and warm pastries filled with nuts and honey. After eating their fill, Hansel and Gretel were led to two soft feather beds, where they drifted into the deepest sleep they had known in weeks. But the old woman was not as kind as she seemed. She was, in fact, a wicked witch who tricked and trapped children to her home so she could fatten them up and eat them. At dawn, the witch suddenly grabbed Hansel and locked him in a small iron cage, its bars rusted and cold to the touch. Gretel, trembling with fear, watched helplessly as her brother gripped the bars, his eyes filled with silent reassurance. The witch cackled as she prodded his thin arm, muttering about how much more he must eat before he was ready for her feast. Each day she forced Gretel to prepare heavy meals, thick chicken stews and fresh baked bread, all meant to get Hansel fat. But Hansel, ever clever, and realizing that her eyes were weak with age, outwitted her by extending a thin chicken bone instead of his finger whenever she reached to check if he had grown plump. The witch, not seeing Hansel's trick, cursed her luck, grumbling that the boy remained as skinny as ever. Weeks passed, and the old woman's impatience grew and grew until she could wait no longer. She declared in a voice sharp with hunger that she would eat him the next day, whether he was fat or thin. That morning she ordered Gretel to rise early and heat the great iron stove. The flames roared and grew as Gretel fed them with dry logs. The heat from the sides of the iron stove shimmered in waves, distorting the air. The witch commanded Gretel to check if the stove was hot enough, gripping Gretel's shoulder with bony fingers. Gretel swallowed hard, her heart pounding, but she pretended to be confused and hesitated, as though she did not understand, whispering in fear that she didn't know how to check. The witch growled, irritated by the girl's clear stupidity. She bent forward to demonstrate how it was done, her hooked nose peering into the fiery open mouth of the great oven. In that moment Gretel saw her chance. With all the strength in her small body, she pushed the old woman forward. The witch shrieked, clawing at the air, but the momentum sent her tumbling into the stove. The flames roared as she fell, her screams twisting into nothing but the crackling of fire. Gretel slammed the iron door shut, bolting it fast. She staggered back, her breath ragged, her hands trembling as she listened to the final echoes of the wicked woman's fate. For a long moment she stood frozen, hardly believing what she had done. Then her brother's voice called from the cage, snapping her back to reality. She rushed to free him, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks. Hansel stepped out, rubbing his wrists where the bars had left red marks. He looked at his sister with wonder, then at the still burning oven. With pride filling his voice, he congratulated Gretel on her bravery, and that she had succeeded in saving them both. And she had. With the witch gone and the heavy air of the cottage lifted, Hansel and Gretel wasted no time. They searched the house, opening every chest and cupboard, where they found glittering gold coins, strings of pearls and gemstones that sparkled like tiny stars. They filled their pockets, their once empty hands now rich with treasure. Together, shoulder to shoulder, they left the witch's house behind, stepping into the open forest, where the trees no longer seemed so threatening. The wind that rustled through the leaves was gentle now, no longer whispering secrets of despair, but carrying them forward, guiding them home. For days they walked, with new-found hope. Though their stomachs ached and their feet were sore, the thought of their father's embrace kept them moving. They didn't even think of their stepmother being home too. The forest no longer felt endless. It felt familiar somehow, as though it too knew they belonged elsewhere, and was helping them to follow their path back to their father. Then, one morning, as the first golden light of dawn painted the treetops, they reached the edge of the woods. Before them, in the distance, was their father's small cottage. With a cry of joy, they ran the final stretch, their hearts racing as fast as their feet could, and the golden coins jingling in their pockets. The door swung open, and their father stood there, frozen in the threshold. His eyes, once dulled by sorrow, filled with tears as he gathered them into his arms. He held them tightly, his hands trembling, whispering words of love and disbelief. As it turns out, their stepmother was not there. She was gone, died not long after forcing the father to abandon the children, her cold heart unable to handle the weight of her own cruelty and her hunger. Now there was no one left to take away their happiness. On learning this, Hansel and Gretel laughed out loud, and emptied their pockets, spilling gold and sparkling jewels onto the wooden floor. Their father gasped in astonishment and joy. They would never again know hunger. They would never again live in fear. Their home, once shadowed with hardship, was now filled with golden light. And so Hansel and Gretel grew up wise and kind, never forgetting the lessons the dark forest had taught them. They knew now that even in the deepest despair, courage and love could always lead the way home. The end. And so ends the tale of Hansel and Gretel, a story of wit, bravery, and the unbreakable bond between brother and sister. May it remind us that even in the face of darkness, light can always be found. Thank you for listening, and may you always find your way safely back home.